You're listening to BioTalk with Rich Bendis, the only podcast focused on the biohealth capital region. Each episode, we'll talk to leaders in the industry to break down the biggest topics happening today in biohealth.
Hi, this is Rich Bendis, host of BioTalk, where we interview very distinct individuals in the biohealth capital region. And we have one of my favorite people from the region. This is the first time we've had her on our podcast, and it's Sara Nayeem, who is a partner with New Enterprise Associates, NEA, one of the largest venture capital funds in the world. And we're fortunate to have them located with their headquarters here in the biohealth capital region. Sara, welcome to BioTalk.
Thank you, Rich. Great to be here.
It's great to have you here. And there's a lot of listeners that hear the name NEA, but it's a mysterious venture capital fund regionally, because you do so many things globally and nationally, in addition to what's in our backyard. So why don't we talk a little bit about you first and give our listeners an idea about your background and how you ended up with NEA?
Sure. Sounds great. So I've been at NEA for almost 11 years, and I focus on investing in biopharma companies. Prior to coming to NEA, I was at Merrill Lynch, where I worked in healthcare investment banking for about 2.5 years. Before that, I was at Yale, where I did an MD, MBA, and did a couple of years of investment banking at Morgan Stanley before that. And I was an undergrad in biology at Harvard before that. So before starting in venture, I had a mix of science and business experience, but really enjoy venture because it involves clinical thinking, interpreting basic science results, collaborating with entrepreneurs, and also its fair share of financial analysis as well. So it covers all the bases.
And it's rare that you have an MD, MBA. It's not that rare, but yet with the people that we interact with here in this region, to have the MD, MBA, and be a venture capitalist is somewhat unique within our region.
And actually, those MD and MBA programs are becoming more common. I think I was in maybe the third or fourth graduating class at Yale. And I think I was the first person who didn't go on to do residency or at least an internship. But I think since then, the profile of people coming out has been quite varied, and people have gone to mostly to the clinical side, and to the business side as well. So,
and being selfish, we're glad you're not practicing medicine and you're actually practicing venture capital.
Leave the medicine to the real doctors.
So let's talk a little bit about NEA and its priorities and really its emphasis on biopharma.
Sure. So NEA is a large, diversified venture capital firm, which has been around for 41 years. We're currently investing out of our $3.3 billion NEA 16 fund. And of this fund, about $1 billion will be deployed into biopharma. And we also within healthcare invest in medical devices, healthcare services, and digital health. On the tech side, we have large practices in enterprise, software and services, as well as in consumer. So in terms of biopharma priorities, we invest across the stage, all the way from seed investments to crossover rounds right before IPO. And we also have a public biopharma practice. And we invest across all different therapeutic areas, but we have particular areas of concentration in oncology, in rare diseases. And while we don't do much strict venture creation in the sense that NEA partners aren't usually taking operational roles at our portfolio companies, we do frequently invest early. About half our companies are seed or Series A when we first invest in them, and about half are B or later. And we also have a rare disease company accelerator called Sidon, based in Boston. We also have a long history of backing serial entrepreneurs. And some of the investment themes for our biopharma practice in the past few years include targeted oncology therapeutics, cell therapy, synthetic biology, gene therapy, gene editing, and pharma spinouts.
And then when we talk about seed and Series A, what's the average round that NEA is doing in those types of companies?
So seed would be anywhere from maybe a total round of $1 million between us and maybe one or two other investors, up to say $3 to $5 million. Beyond that, you really would start to call it a Series A. And so we might be taking very small stakes of $500,000 to $1 million in a seed round. And the A's can really become quite large these days. So we used to have A's that were, say, 15 to 30 million was a typical Series A in the biopharma industry. And now many Series A's are greater than 50 million. It really varies, anywhere from 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 million in a Series A.
And one of the things we're noticing in this region, which we'll talk a little bit about later, is that the average size of the round is getting larger. And we're actually seeing some 9-digit Series A's over $100 million, which is unfathomable.
Right. The concern with those structures are you can really overcapitalize companies, and it can be a bit challenging then for a Series B if the company, if anything has gone sideways or the strategy has changed, and then you're sitting on a post of well over $100 million for a Series B. It can make for some challenging discussions.
Let's talk a little bit about what you're seeing as some of the new areas or new developments in the biopharma space, because as you know, priorities change within venture capital firms on a year-to-year basis based on the new trends that are emerging.
So the biggest advances in recent years, I think, have been in two main areas. The first one would be new treatment modalities. So some of these are treatment modalities that have the potential to provide a one-time cure, like gene therapy, which involves delivering a copy of a missing or defective gene, or even more extraordinary is gene editing, which involves editing a cell's DNA to insert, delete, or modify a gene, mostly ex vivo, but with potential applications in vivo. And mRNA therapy is also a big modality which is related to gene therapy. So instead of delivering DNA one time and then depending on the cell's machinery to make that into RNA and then eventually translate that to protein, mRNA therapy delivers mRNA chronically. And the advantages are that over gene therapy are greater predictability of the clinical benefit, wider potential use, but the disadvantage is, of course, that it doesn't represent a one-time cure. And the other area where I'd say there have been major advances are in the broad area of immuno-oncology, or IO, as people call it. So that involves harnessing a patient's immune system to fight cancer. And the promise is that we would not just push out survival curves, buying patients a few more months, but actually lift the curve. So some subset of patients would get, in effect, a cure, or at least a very long-lived response to therapy. The main category of immuno-oncology therapies are checkpoint inhibitors. Those involve releasing the brakes on the immune system, and those have become standard of care across a number of different types of cancer and a number of different lines of therapy. This class of drugs, which include PD-1 inhibitors and PD-L1 inhibitors, are expected to eventually top $30 to $40 billion in sales per year. On the other hand, some classes of therapies that were really promising in early clinical trials to add to PD-1s, unfortunately, have disappointed in the clinic when we went to randomized placebo-controlled studies. So some of these combo strategies are still playing out in the clinic, and there are an enormous number of trials going on right now. So it can be a little bit hard to parse through in the immuno-oncology space, which will eventually be the winners. Cell therapies such as CAR-Ts, which genetically engineer patients' T cells and return those back to the patient so they can go and find and destroy the cancer, are also very promising. There, we've mainly seen them work in hematologic cancers, but the vast majority of yearly deaths are actually from solid tumors. So that's a key challenge there. So I think from here, the industry needs to capitalize on the potential of new treatment modalities and demonstrate that they actually can be as transformative across a large number of diseases as people hope. And then for immuno-oncology, really, to fulfill its promise, it needs to be applied more broadly to immunologically cold solid tumors and also increase the response rate so more patients can benefit from these therapies.
So that's a great perspective on the priorities for NEA in the biopharma space. But you've been there 11 years now. So what are the major changes you've seen in the venture capital world in the last 10, 11 years since you've become a venture capitalist?
So the biggest shift in the landscape has been the public market. When I started in venture capital, there was a dearth of biopharma IPOs back in 2009. In 2013, the IPO quote-unquote window, as we call it, opened, and it's been basically open the entire time since then, with record number of IPOs, record number of follow-on finances and total amounts raised, both IPO and follow-ons. And also, IPOs have been getting done for companies at early and earlier stages. So, for instance, 2018, almost half the IPOs that were done that year were preclinical or phase 1, which would have been unheard of 10 years ago. And a lot of this has been driven by these big scientific platforms and what people see as the enormous promise to revolutionize human health. And that has also created a case of the haves and have-nots, where some of these big science platforms, particularly early enough that there still can be this immense promise, they are getting the most attention. And on the other side, traditional drug development programs are getting less attention and less funding, particularly in the public market. So whereas later stage clinical data used to be essential for an IPO, it's now can be seen as a liability. Small biopharma companies actually tend to disappoint in their commercial launches. What's become a familiar trend is that when a company releases strong phase 3 data, their stock price will shoot up and there's all this M&A speculation, perhaps they'll get taken out. And then if that doesn't happen, then often the stock price will sort of nosedive until they're at least a year or so through their launch and can prove whether or not they can actually launch the product. And then another trend that's been really important has been the rise or upward spike, really, that was always there in venture creation. So venture firms like Third Rock, Atlas, Arch, they build companies in-house. And as we mentioned, both with venture creation and with more traditional company formation, there's also been an uptick in the size of the Series A rounds. And then often your Series B is actually your crossover round and you're taking that company's going public sometimes when they're a year or two from the clinic. It sometimes does feel like a game of musical chairs with everybody wondering when the music will stop. And then part of the reason for the overcapitalization has also been new sources of capital from generalists, capital from Asia, and also crossover and public funds that have been moving into earlier stage investing. In terms of how it's affected NEA or how we've responded to these trends, we have both looked at going earlier and later in stage. So as I mentioned, we have side-in and other efforts that have been on the company creation side. And we also have really ticked up the number of seed investments that we've done, particularly last year or so. And on the later stage side, we have an active practice looking at fallen angels, as we call them, in the public market, where often the valuations may actually have caught up faster to reality than in the private market. And we've also been spending more time looking at companies in Europe where the science is still really as strong as it is in the U.S., but there's a lot less competition for the best deals.
Well, that's a broad perspective. A lot of changes, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the other thing is, and we'll talk about the BioHealth Capital region a little bit more, but in the past, we were passed over for a number of the trends you were talking about, but I think we're starting to get involved in the mainstream of a lot of those trends. And when you talk about public IPOs, it's exciting to see Viela and NextCure this year with their IPOs right here in our region.
Yes, and hopefully there'll be more.
Many more to come, I hope. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what do you think the implications are for entrepreneurs? If they're looking for funding, researchers looking to form companies right now, what are the different implications for them today versus the past?
So I think the rise of the venture creation model means it might be a little harder to get funding if you're not part of the Boston or San Francisco ecosystem and plugged into some of those firms I mentioned that have these major venture creation efforts. A little harder. So there's been this debate in the industry. However, there are, of course, always traditional venture and many firms like our own that do traditional venture as well. But I think either way, it's more important than ever to be looped into startup networks, academic networks, getting to know venture capitalists and getting to know the key opinion leaders in the indications that you're going into, because often they're the people that investors speak to. And I think, as I mentioned, for spaces that are not quote unquote hot, there's certainly been less appetite in the public market. And then that bleeds back into the venture world as well. Not quite as fast, but there is, I think, certain areas where venture investors just don't want to play. One area where that tide may be changing is central nervous system, so CNS, particularly neurodegenerative and psych. For many years, venture capitalists just avoided those areas, and there was not a lot of venture capital deployed. But now there are more and more firms interested in CNS. There's the Dementia Discovery Fund, where different venture firms and BioPharma companies are coming together to really recognize that neurodegeneration is a huge, huge issue for society, and we really haven't made that much progress on solving it yet. And at the same time that there's that recognition of this immense unmet need, there's also a lot of new science around things like the gut-brain axis, new imaging and biomarker modalities, things that can help us identify patients at risk earlier and also, importantly, ensure target engagement earlier so that even in a phase 1 trial, you can get a good sense of where you're getting target engagement. And I think for academics who are looking to form a company around their research, really forming relationships with investors early on is important because they may indeed decide to form a company around your technology. But also, it's important to get credible entrepreneurs involved early on. And often this can be on a part-time consulting basis. Sometimes when executives are looking for their next gig, they may go and consult for a year or so and look at lots of different technologies and end up signing up full-time for the one that they find the most interesting. And it's also really important, I think, to leverage this huge stable of retired biopharma executives who are really excited to serve as advisors and mentors and independent board members if they think your technology is exciting. And again, as I mentioned, the key opinion leaders are critical. So getting them on board and making sure that they're actually really involved in your company and not just serving on a list of scientific advisory board members, but really engaged and can speak knowledgeably about your company or about your technology if you're trying to make it into a company.
Really some good points you're bringing out. And I guess the key is, what do you think is happening in the biohealth capital region in the last 10 years? How has entrepreneurism changed in the last decade here?
I think it has changed for the better. And I would attribute that in part to BHI, Biohealth Innovation, which is, as people listening may know,
pay me now or pay you later, right?
No, I think it's a great public-private partnership devoted to increasing the flow of capital to the region, increasing the commercialization of innovations in the area. The challenge with the area has been we've always had great science between the NIH, Hopkins, the University of Maryland, the FDA here, but it's been challenging at times to start companies in the area because there just hasn't been this strong group of entrepreneurs. And also some of the academic institutions in the area have not been as successful or as active in commercializing their technologies and out-licensing them. And a lot of that has to do with trying to make things more streamlined and figuring out what are the best technologies and how to market those to people who might want to in-license them. So I think efforts like BHI as well as others have really improved this ecosystem. And that can be seen in things like Viela Bio, which you mentioned, and spin-outs from MedImmune, employers like Gilead and Paragon opening manufacturing facilities in the area. And I'd say from our own experience at NEA, we have gradually had more companies in the area that either we've started or that we've invested in and have had, I think, better success over time in recruiting top management to those companies. For instance, Arcellx is a company in Gaithersburg that my colleague Ali Babahani started with a couple of other firms. And even with that team, most of the team that was recruited was local, but there were also people that they brought in from the West Coast and other parts of the East Coast that moved to the DC area. So it's a great area to live in. You know, I think there's so many things about this area that make it very livable for entrepreneurs and great schools and all of the wonderful things about the area. And if you can just get enough of that starting management team, then you can recruit people in. And of course, here, as well as in other parts of the country, biopharma companies will always use someone may live somewhere else but travel here and work here 2 or 3 days a week. But I think there have been a lot of improvements in the overall ecosystem, as well as more thoughtful out-licensing efforts at the NIH and all the academic institutions in the region. We've definitely seen that improve, and the EIR program at BHI, I think, has helped a lot with that, with just awareness of how to market the technologies, and again, how to, if possible, start companies in the area around those technologies.
I know there's been a lot of criticism because in the past, this was sort of a drive-through or a flyover region, but I think we're starting to become a little destination spot because we think there's great values here within the region, especially when you compare what you have to pay to get into some deals in San Francisco and Boston right now. And the thing about talent, and one of your portfolio companies, Arcellx, David Hilbert and I have talked several times that he was able to hire most of his senior management team right from the region and then attract what they needed to build the company. And that really speaks well for the quality of the talent we have here. And people say we don't have enough C-level talent to build companies. And I think that's changing.
I agree. And it's all about getting to that critical juncture where when someone sells their company or is ready to move on from a bigger company and start a company, that critical mass of people. And so there's really an inflection point where that 6 or 9 months that they want to spend looking. And at that point, if they don't find something in the region, then they move to Boston or they move to RTP or the West Coast, that they find something exciting in that period of time. So it's great that we have companies that also plays into raising bigger and bigger rounds, because companies that are doing their own manufacturing and in cell therapy space, et cetera, they are going to have larger and larger workforces. And so you can bring in more and more people. It's not just 5 or 10 senior management. It can be companies to 100 people or more.
We're speaking with Sara Nayeem, who's partner with New Enterprise Associates, NEA. And there are pros and cons of people when they're trying to raise capital or grow a company, whether they should take venture capital or whether they shouldn't. What do you think the implications are for people who are looking for funding and the pros and cons related to VC?
Sure. So I think growth capital is often required in order to move a business from one stage to the next, whether that means expanding your commercial effort, going to a new geography, or expanding into a new clinical indication for a drug that you might be developing. And in biopharma, the costs to get a drug approved are so high that it's pretty uncommon for entrepreneurs to be able to move a therapeutics program very far before they'll require institutional capital. But as mentioned earlier, there have been an increase in capital from other sources that are non-traditional, so high net worth individuals, family offices, investors that are from Asia but are not biotech traditionally, and other non-traditional sources.
SBIRs.
SBIRs, yes. So I think this capital from non-traditional sources, it can sometimes be a quicker route to financing, and sometimes it's the only route. So in that case, take it. But there are some risks to this strategy that I think entrepreneurs should think about it carefully. Sometimes we find that the valuations can get really off. There may be terms around things like founder control that are ultimately untenable for institutional investors. And often the capital doesn't end up being deployed as optimally as we would like. Maybe things are not moved forward as quickly, or there might be an indication that's chosen that a lot of capital is spent on, and then later you find out that venture investors just really don't like that particular indication. So I think that trying to find institutional investors as early as possible, or at least getting good advice from them, is important, particularly in biopharma, because again, it's really uncommon to be able to build those companies without large amounts of capital. And even if you do build a company with non-traditional sources of capital, later on you will probably need to add well-regarded VCs in order to take the company public. So at that point, if there have been some of these sort of challenges in the capital structure and in the documents, it can be a little hard to overcome those limitations later. But ideally, experienced venture capitalists are not only providing funding, but they're also serving as advisors, as sounding boards for portfolio companies. They should be helping with hiring, with BD intros. They should also market the company for the next round of financing and be really knowledgeable about where you're taking the company.
So all VCs and investors are not created equal. So if I'm looking for the right strategic partner as an investor, as well as potentially complementing my management team with the right board members, what are the characteristics I'm looking for in both the investor side as well as the board side?
First and foremost, the potential investor needs to have access to capital. And often, particularly in biopharma, the companies will need significant capital and what we like to call patient capital. So I think one red flag entrepreneurs sometimes miss is a firm that's running low on reserves in that particular fund. And many times, even though firms can raise additional funds, they can't always cross over an investment to their next fund. So it's important to ask about the reserves, and particularly if you plan on going public or that's even a possibility, making sure that you have a sense for the participation in that, because these days insiders need to contribute at least 30% to 40% of the capital for an IPO for biopharma companies. And it's also important when you're setting up the financing documents to appropriately incentivize all the investors to put in the subsequent rounds of financing if there are multiple tranches, and to think critically around what those tranching milestones are. So looking for an investor who has a thoughtful approach to tranching and structuring. And then beyond capital, I always advise entrepreneurs to look for investors who've already been successful in investing in their space, because they'll have credibility, they'll have connections that can be helpful, and also look for investors that aim to deeply understand your company. I think sometimes at NEA we can have a very in-depth diligence process, and which makes sense because we're investing sometimes 25, 30 million or more at a time. But while it may seem painful at the time, if you have investors that are doing deep diligence on the company, it really ultimately serves to your benefit, because those are the investors that will be the most useful on the board. They'll also be the most likely to be helpful in communicating the story to other potential investors, potential acquirers. And once you get your lead, then often that lead takes a major role in finishing syndicating your round. So if they're good at communicating your story and they understand your story and they've truly vetted all the elements of your company, then they'll be more effective at building that syndicate. Another important thing to look for as a CEO is whether or not you can have open dialogue with each of your board members and investors. And if you are considering an investor and they don't really make time for periodic updates, or they don't return your emails, that's a red flag. Sometimes it could be a junior or mid-level investing professional at a firm that you can have the closest relationship with for more non-urgent items, but you'll always want to be able to get the decision maker for that investment on the phone if you need to. And then I think for independent board members, we always encourage our CEOs to think in terms of expertise that might be missing on their board or in their company. So it might be a commercial leader. It could be a CEO that's previously taken a company public or commercialized a product or sold a company, or it could be an academic that has deep clinical trial experience that maybe is a little missing, on the management team, for instance, in a very specific area where your CMO might be really experienced in clinical trials in one indication, but you're actually developing your drug in multiple indications. So I think one way for CEOs to gauge if an independent board member will be value added is to ask themselves, would this person be useful at least once a quarter in a conversation outside the board meeting with someone on my management team or with me? And then once you add that person, make sure those calls actually get set up. And then I think finally, independent board members can be really helpful in extending the executive team's network and the board's network. So it's important to add board members who are explicitly willing to do some outreach on the company's behalf when it's helpful.
One of the things that I read about almost every day is criticism about venture capital, and it's not diverse. It's a good old boys club. And what are your thoughts on diversity in venture capital, and what is NEA doing to try to increase diversity, encourage inclusion, and give more people opportunities to get into this very difficult industry where there isn't a straight path to?
At NEA, we firmly believe that gender and ethnic diversity is extremely important for the venture industry and for better outcomes at our portfolio companies. There's no shortage of talent that could fuel a diverse ecosystem of entrepreneurs and investors, but it's really the onus is on the VC industry to be more proactive about creating that culture of inclusion. Our portfolio currently includes 80 plus women CEOs and co-founders, so that's high for our industry, but we're not there yet. We need to keep working at it. We have a diversity and inclusion committee at NEA, which Dana Grayson leads on our tech side and I lead on the healthcare side. Dana also helps lead the East Coast efforts of Allraise, which is an organization that seeks to increase diversity in the tech industry. So initially, this diversity and inclusion committee was formed when our industry was grappling with some of the scandals and this awareness that in Silicon Valley, it was rife with instances of sexual harassment, sexual discrimination. And we've also had our fair share of healthcare industry scandals, healthcare VC scandals, maybe a little less public, but we've had those as well. So we started out by supporting initiatives like Allraise, Parity Partners. There's an initiative called Black VC for encouraging diversity and among people of color that was started by one of our former analysts at NEA. We've also conducted unconscious bias training for our full investing staff. And in recent years, we've thought about our recruiting efforts and how can we really make sure that we're getting as diverse a pool as possible. And then, of course, we will extend the offer to the most eligible and talented person. But what we found is that to make sure we have a really diverse group of candidates, we have to start earlier. We have to reach out to people earlier in their career and just be more proactive about building a stable of contacts and connections. And then one element that we use later in our recruiting process for analysts and principals, et cetera, and associates is a case study. So what we've done is we've begun to anonymize the case study write-up. So when they come through, an assistant will anonymize them, take all the names off of them and any identifying information so that those of us who are reading through them and scoring them will have limited bias going into those and won't just be using them to confirm our pre-existing thoughts on the candidates. Finally, we started to celebrate diversity more intentionally. So last year, prior to our 40th year anniversary celebration, we had our first firm-wide event for women at NEA. The aim was to recognize the accomplishments of all the women at the firm, but especially Carmen Chang, who's our first female general partner. And we're going to have another such event in October. And we are hoping to make it an annual reception and use it also to gain lots of feedback on what types of programming would be most useful for diversity and inclusion, whether that's mentoring, social events, training, et cetera. So we also think there should be more open dialogue in the venture industry about what are the best practices that different firms are using. So hopefully that will increase with efforts those of us who are involved at NEVCA and VCA, et cetera.
Those sound like great initiatives. And one of the things you talked about was your 80 women CEOs in your portfolio. But if I look at all the stats, I think that there's less than 5% women CEOs that get funded by venture capital, and probably less than 10% of women in venture capital firms in management. So you talked on some of the things that need to be done, but how can women support each other more in trying to grow the awareness that they're equal to their peers and they can do just as good a job as anybody else in the VC world or the investing world and get greater inclusion?
I think a few things we can do. So I think the first thing is sharing deal flow. In venture, you're largely defined by the quality and innovation in the companies that you back and that you help advance. And even the process of looking at companies that you ultimately pass on is important for networking and for learning. And second, by mentoring younger women in the field, helping them advance their careers, by making them the first contact on a new deal instead of their direct boss, and offering perspectives. And I think a lot of professional fields lose some women when they have children. Many decide to become part-time or consult or just move to board work only or just leave the professional world entirely. I think the venture is a field with a long view, which is very positive for men and women with children, unlike some other finance jobs such as hedge fund investing, where you're really just measured off the last 12 months of your performance. So I think some firms recognize it more than others, and some will allow more flexibility in terms of how much you travel and how selective you can be about where your portfolio companies are geographically. But I think as an industry, we have to get to the point where it's accepted that it's acceptable that within a multi-decade career, a few slower years or a few more local years are okay for men and for women, for everyone. I mean, I recognize that not all new parents slow down, but I think that's important for just maximizing the number of women who stay in the field. And then I think leadership and visibility are vitally important. Women investors who serve on boards, who are serving on panels, active on social media, serve on the boards of industry groups like NVCA and EVCA, et cetera. All of these send the message to more junior women in the field that we as women can be leading voices in the industry. And that's also not just the case for venture, of course, but for the broader biopharma entrepreneurial community. And then lastly, I would say just getting to know other women in VC, or if you're an entrepreneur, other women entrepreneurs, is tremendously important. You know, socializing with co-investors outside of board meetings has been really fun and fulfilling for me personally. And I also think that those friendships make us better advisors for our portfolio companies and help us work together better and read the boardroom better and just make sure that we're aligned, and that actually when we disagree, we can do so without feeling like we're going to upset one another. Often if you have young children, you can feel like you're pulled in many directions, and sometimes we feel guilty about taking time to socialize. But I think it's an investment of time that's well worth it professionally and personally to just get to know other women and other men in your industry.
This has been one of the best BioTalks that I've had the opportunity to have. I want to thank Sara Nayeem, who's a partner with New Enterprise Associates, for her commitment to the venture capital industry, to her support of the biohealth capital region, and her support of biohealth innovation as she's helped support us in our 8 years in our existence. So, Sara, thank you very much for being on BioTalk. We can't wait another 10 years before we get you back again. I want you to come back and talk about all the new exciting things happening in your life.
Thank you very much, Rich. Great pleasure to be here and appreciated it. Had a great time talking with you today.
Thanks for listening to BioTalk with Rich Bendis.